They wore crowns, commanded empires, and dined on gold while their people starved. History remembers them as rulers, but their subjects remembered them as nightmares. From paranoid emperors who thought they were gods to kings who gambled away kingdoms and queens who ruled with venom in their smiles. These 33 royals weren't just bad leaders, they were spectacular jerks, petty, paranoid, power-drunk, and they all had thrones. Welcome to the darker side of royalty, where bloodlines ran thick with entitlement. Before we dive in, if you love dark history, royal scandals, and stories that make you question everything you learned in school, hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila, 3 a.m. in Chicago? We're all up late with these monarchs, might as well get acquainted. 1. Caligula, Roman Emperor. Some men are born to rule, others are born to entertain. And then there's Caligula, a man who turned the Roman Empire into his own personal fever dream, complete with divine cosplay, forced laughter, and the slow-motion unraveling of imperial sanity. To the Senate, he was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. To Rome, he was Caligula, or Little Boots, a childhood nickname that stuck and curdled. Historians still argue whether he was truly insane, just politically theatrical, or both, but what no one disputes is that he was, by all contemporary accounts, an egomaniacal sadist with the self-awareness of a stage prop. Early on, Rome had hope. Caligula was the great-grandson of Augustus, beloved as a boy who grew up among soldiers. But once he took power in 37 CE, hope tripped over a toga and face-planted into chaos. What began as a promising rule quickly spiraled into bizarre cruelty. He declared himself a living god, built temples to himself, ordered sacrifices in his name. He'd reportedly whisper to statues of gods at night, mocking them for not being as powerful as he was. Subtle. Then there was his famous horse, Incitatus. The rumor goes that Caligula loved the animal so much he gave it a marble stall, an ivory manger, and a house with servants, and allegedly tried to appoint it to the Senate. Some historians doubt this actually happened, but like most things with Caligula, the truth doesn't matter nearly as much as the absurdity that people believed it could be true. He relished public executions, not just as political necessity, but as sport. He'd invite guests to dinner parties, only to have prisoners tortured during dessert, just to test their reactions. If someone flinched, they might join the entertainment lineup next. It wasn't just cruelty, it was curated performance cruelty, designed for maximum humiliation. He allegedly forced high-ranking senators to grovel, perform degrading acts, or risk execution for showing the faintest sign of dignity. And when his coffers ran low from lavish spending, he'd invent new taxes on things like lawsuits, marriage, and even prostitution, and then reportedly opened his own palace brothel, staffed with senators' wives. But Caligula's worst sin might have been how boringly predictable his madness became. Even tyranny needs plot twists, and Caligula delivered them with all the finesse of a falling column. He mocked Rome's traditions, insulted its nobility, and alienated nearly everyone except his personal guard, who in the end decided enough was enough. He was assassinated in 41 CE by his own Praetorian Guard, stabbed 30 times in a palace hallway, reportedly while still confused as to why anyone would kill a god. And still, the most unsettling part wasn't that Caligula ruled Rome. It's that for a brief moment, Rome seemed okay with it. They let the circus run because the bread still came. It's a reminder that the line between cruelty and comedy depends entirely on who's holding the knife and who's clapping. Of course, if you thought Caligula was petty, wait until you meet the man who followed him. His name was Nero. And where Caligula liked to watch others suffer, Nero preferred to burn the stage down and perform on top of the ashes. 2. Nero, Roman Emperor. If Caligula was the emperor who treated Rome like a plaything, Nero was the one who turned it into a stage, often literally. Where his predecessor ruled through theatrical cruelty, Nero ruled through performance. And like all great performers, he demanded an audience. It didn't matter whether they were senators, slaves, or citizens. If they weren't applauding, they were disposable. Nero fancied himself an artist. The problem was, he had the power of a god and the ego of a theatre critic. And when emperors start thinking they're misunderstood geniuses, things rarely end well. Nero became emperor in 54 CE at the age of 16, after the suspicious death of his adoptive father, Emperor Claudius. It was widely rumored that his mother, Agrippina the Younger, had poisoned Claudius to place Nero on the throne, and whether or not that's true, it sets the tone nicely. Agrippina didn't just want a son on the throne, she wanted a puppet. And for a little while Nero played along. His early rule was guided by capable advisors like the philosopher Seneca and the general Burrus, and for a brief, shining moment, Rome thought it had a promising young ruler. Then Nero hit adolescence, in public. With an empire at his fingertips, he began resenting his mother's control. Agrippina, once his greatest supporter, became his greatest threat. Power struggles between mother and son aren't uncommon in history, but few end with a palace-backed murder plot. After a series of failed attempts involving poison and collapsible boats, Nero finally succeeded in having Agrippina killed, stabbed by his men and left for dead. He even reportedly examined the body afterward and made jokes. Family dynamics in the Julio-Claudian dynasty were tense. From there, things spiraled. Nero grew increasingly obsessed with art, music, and his own legacy. He took to performing poetry and playing the lyre in public, sometimes forcing the Roman elite to sit through hours-long recitals. Applause was mandatory. Fainting from heat exhaustion was common. Some reportedly faked death just to get out of attendance. This was not governance. It was vanity, weaponized and state-funded. But the most infamous chapter of Nero's reign came in 64 CE, when a massive fire engulfed Rome. It burned for over a week, destroying large portions of the city. Rumors spread quickly that Nero had fiddled while the city burned, anachronistic, as fiddles didn't exist yet, or that he had started the fire himself to clear space for his new palace. Whatever the truth, Nero's response didn't help. He blamed the Christians, a small but growing sect, and launched the first official persecution against them. Executions followed, public punishments, spectacles. He fed fear into fire, turning tragedy into justification. Nero's personal life was no less chaotic. He married several times, including to one man, Sporus, whom he allegedly had castrated and then wed in a ceremony designed to mimic his former wife. Again, whether this was love, performance, or both is unclear. What is clear is that Nero's concept of monarchy was fluid, dramatic, and largely unhinged. As the years dragged on, his rule became more erratic. He alienated the Senate, bankrupted the treasury with lavish building projects like the opulent Domus Aurea, and retreated further into fantasy. His paranoia grew, as did the list of those condemned for treason. In 68 CE, rebellion finally broke out. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. Alone, abandoned, and no longer protected by the illusion of his own greatness, Nero fled. Before his death, he reportedly paced and muttered, "What an artist dies in me." It's the kind of line that would make for excellent tragedy, if it weren't so drenched in irony. Nero wasn't a failed artist. He was a failed emperor who mistook applause for approval and spectacle for leadership. His reign left Rome weakened, traumatized, and more than a little scorched. And as we leave behind the man who turned the empire into a stage, we turn to the emperor who turned the Colosseum into his own personal arena. Commodus didn't just wear the title of Caesar, He wore the costume of Hercules, carried a club, and charged the Roman treasury for every swing. By the way, if you're 2 royals in and still listening, you're our kind of people. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. We've got 31 more crown-clad disasters coming your way. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what ungodly hour is it over there? We know royalty attracts night owls. 3. Commodus, Roman Emperor. If Nero was an emperor playing at being an artist, Commodus was an emperor who thought he was a demigod and wanted the world to pay for front-row seats. The son of the wise and revered Marcus Aurelius, Commodus was born into expectations he had no intention of meeting. His reign, 177 to 192 CE, is often seen as the moment Rome started to unravel, when the empire stopped pretending that leadership required competence and started rewarding delusion dressed in gold. At first glance, Commodus had all the ingredients for success. He was young, attractive, and heir to a respected philosopher king, but unlike his father, who spent his life writing stoic meditations and leading troops in battle, Commodus was more interested in chariot races and gladiator games. His reign wasn't about governance, it was about image, and his favorite image was himself, oiled and shirtless, pretending to be Hercules. Seriously, Commodus wasn't just a fan of the hero. He identified as him. He commissioned statues of himself wearing a lion's skin and wielding a club. He renamed months of the calendar after himself. He changed Rome's name to Colonia Commodiana. The Senate, fearing execution or exile, played along, but beneath the muscle flexing and pageantry was a dangerously unstable ruler with a violent streak and a paper-thin ego. Commodus enjoyed participating in gladiator games, not from the sidelines, but in the arena. He would dress in elaborate costumes and fight wounded animals, disabled gladiators or opponents who were under strict orders not to hurt him. These weren't contests. They were performances, rigged from the start, and for each appearance, he reportedly charged the state an exorbitant fee, draining the treasury for his hobby of state-sponsored cosplay. But Commodus wasn't content with just playing Hercules. He demanded worship, obedience, and theatrical loyalty. Those who criticized him disappeared. The Senate became a fearful rubber stamp. Conspiracies began to swirl, and not without reason. He survived several assassination attempts, including one involving his own sister. Each betrayal made him more paranoid, more violent, more isolated. Eventually, real power in Rome shifted to his favorites, particularly a former slave-turned-chamberlain named Cleander, who effectively ran the empire while Commodus flexed in the mirror. Corruption flourished. Offices were sold to the highest bidder. The military grew restless. The people, once entertained by his antics, grew tired. Commodus was finally assassinated in 192 CE. The method, a staged wrestling match gone wrong. A group of conspirators, including his own inner circle, had him strangled. His death ended the Nerva-Antonine dynasty and threw Rome into a year of civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Looking back, Commodus wasn't just a bad emperor, he was a turning point, the moment when the rot inside the imperial system became too obvious to ignore. He mistook fear for respect and fantasy for leadership. And when your most memorable policy is renaming Rome after yourself, history tends not to be kind. But Commodus's ego was at least self-contained. The next royal jerk on our list took his hunger for power and turned it into a national shakedown. Meet King John of England, the man so bad they wrote Magna Carta just to get him to stop acting like, well, himself. 4. King John of England. King John of England is the reason the English monarchy needed fine print. Reigning from 1199 to 1216, John's legacy is so infamously awful that even Shakespeare wrote him as a cautionary tale, and modern-day Brits can still use a right John as an insult. He's remembered as cruel, greedy, paranoid, and comically inept, a royal cocktail so potent it eventually gave birth to one of history's most important legal documents, the Magna Carta. Let's start with the basics. John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Nicknamed Lackland because he wasn't expected to inherit anything significant, John compensated for this early insecurity by clawing his way to power, often over the backs of his own family. He famously tried to seize the throne while his brother Richard the Lionheart was away on crusade. When that failed, he waited, and when Richard died in 1199, John ascended, not through glory, but by default. His reign started badly and got worse. He lost vast swaths of English territory in France, including Normandy, to King Philip II. This wasn't just a military blunder, it was a national humiliation. The English nobility, many of whom owned land on both sides of the Channel, saw their influence shrink overnight. John blamed everyone but himself. To fund his flailing campaigns, he turned to extortion. He raised taxes repeatedly, demanded outrageous scuttages, fees to avoid military service, and imposed fines for almost any legal infraction. Noble heirs were charged to inherit. Widows were charged to avoid remarriage. He even reportedly sold official positions, and then charged the same price again to keep them. If there was a way to monetize royal privilege, John found it. But his real specialty was alienating everyone. He fell out with the barons, the church, and his own allies. He seized lands, held hostages, and demanded loyalty oaths, like a medieval mob boss. He excommunicated himself in a dispute with the Pope over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, leaving England spiritually and politically isolated for years. Eventually, the barons had enough. In 1215, they forced John to sign the Magna Carta, a charter of liberties that, among other things, established that the king was subject to the law, not above it. It was a humiliating moment, and John signed it only to buy time. Almost immediately, he broke its terms, plunging the country into civil war. John died in 1216, supposedly of dysentery, but he might as well have died of royal burnout. He left the crown to his 9-year-old son, Henry III, and a kingdom deeply divided. His legacy? A warning label for absolute monarchy. A royal disaster so profound that England had to invent constitutional law just to survive him. And unlike some monarchs whose reputations soften over time, John's has stayed rock bottom. Not even the legends could save him. In the Robin Hood tales, he's still the snivelling villain, forever scheming and forever losing, because some reputations aren't misunderstood, they're earned. 5. Richard II of England. Richard II didn't invent royal arrogance, but he might have perfected it. Crowned King of England at just 10 years old in 1377, Richard began his reign with the wide-eyed wonder of a child in a golden costume. He ended it locked in a cell, betrayed by his own cousin, his crown taken not in battle, but in humiliation. Between those 2 points is a royal life defined by vanity, vengeance, and a slow-burning political tantrum that eventually blew up the monarchy. As a boy king, Richard relied heavily on advisors, particularly his uncles and a shifting cast of ambitious nobles who often ruled in his name. The most infamous test of his early rule came during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands of angry commoners marched on London demanding economic justice. Richard, to his credit, showed courage. He met with the rebels, negotiated, and even calmed the crowds after the murder of their leader, Wat Tyler. For a moment, the people saw him as a possible savior. But that moment passed. As Richard matured, he began to believe the divine hype. Kings, he reasoned, weren't just rulers. They were God's chosen, untouchable, unchallengeable. And Richard didn't just embrace that idea, he practically wrapped himself in it like a velvet cocoon. He cultivated an image of royal grandeur that bordered on obsessive. Portraits of Richard show him in stylized, almost saintly poses. He surrounded himself with flatterers and purged those who questioned his authority. Parliament, a nuisance. The nobles, distrusted. He created new titles for his favourites, elevated them above long-established lords, and rewarded loyalty not with reason, but with power and land. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the barons. A group of them, known as the Lords Appellant, rose in rebellion. They forced Richard into submission, executed several of his allies, and temporarily took control of the government. Richard waited, plotted, and when the moment came, he struck back with a long, cold memory. Once he reasserted control, he began systematically hunting down his former enemies. Trials were staged, lands confiscated, and rival houses dismantled. His rule, once merely arrogant, became vengeful. By the late 1390s, Richard had worn out his welcome. He exiled his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, son of the powerful John of Gaunt, and then seized his estates when Gaunt died. It was a bald-faced land grab, and it pushed even loyal nobles toward rebellion. Henry returned to England in 1399, supposedly just to reclaim his inheritance. Within weeks, he had an army, a movement, and a new title, King Henry IV. Richard was captured, deposed, and imprisoned, stripped not only of power, but of the fantasy he'd constructed around himself. He died in captivity under unclear circumstances. Some say it was starvation, others say something more deliberate. Whatever the method, the meaning was clear. A king who believed he was above politics was, in the end, crushed by it. Richard II's legacy is immortalized not just in the annals of bad kingship, but in Shakespeare's play bearing his name. There he's portrayed as poetic, aloof, and tragically narcissistic. A man who thought being king was about destiny, when it was really about keeping your head in the game. He failed, and the English crown learned a painful lesson. Even divine right can be revoked. And if Richard was undone by arrogance, his successor set a new bar for destructive excess. Henry VIII wasn't just a tyrant. He was a wrecking ball in royal tights, smashing everything from monasteries to marriages in his pursuit of legacy and love. 6. Henry VIII of England. Henry VIII didn't just take the crown. He made it a personal brand. And the brand was this: larger than life, ruthlessly ambitious, and never ever wrong. Ruling from 1509 to 1547, Henry's reign was a high-drama, high-stakes Tudor soap opera, filled with shifting alliances, political purges, and a romantic track record that would make a reality show blush. But behind the courtly dances and grand portraits was a man whose appetite for control knew no limits. At first, he wasn't supposed to rule. His older brother Arthur was the heir apparent. But when Arthur died young, Henry stepped into the spotlight and married Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, as a diplomatic necessity. For a while, the marriage worked. Henry played the part of the dashing Renaissance prince. He jousted, wrote music, debated theology, and revelled in the image of a philosopher king. Then came the succession problem. Catherine failed to produce a male heir, and that, in Henry's mind, meant the marriage and the future of the Tudor line was in jeopardy. His solution? Divorce. His problem? The Pope said no. So Henry did what any supremely confident, entitlement-soaked monarch might do. He broke England off from the Catholic Church and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This wasn't just a spiritual rebellion, it was a political earthquake. Henry dissolved monasteries, seized church lands, and created a new religious order built around royal authority. Those who resisted, Thomas More, Thomas Fisher, countless monks and nobles, were executed. Loyalty to Henry wasn't optional, it was mandatory, under penalty of death. Of course, the wives. History remembers Henry best for his 6 marriages, a roster that reads like a grim carousel of hope, betrayal, and beheadings. Catherine of Aragon was divorced, Anne Boleyn was executed, Jane Seymour died, Anne of Cleves was divorced, Catherine Howard was executed, Catherine Parr survived. Behind each of these marriages were dynastic stakes, political gambits, and Henry's desperate desire for a son. Only Jane Seymour gave him one, Edward VI, who would die young. Over time, Henry's body reflected his reign. Once athletic and charismatic, he grew obese and chronically ill. His moods darkened. His court became a paranoid maze of intrigue and shifting loyalties. Ministers like Thomas Cromwell rose and fell with terrifying speed. Even those who helped him achieve his greatest victories often ended up under the axe. And yet, Henry achieved what many kings only dreamed of: total control. He reshaped religion, subdued the nobility, and centralized the power of the monarchy like no English ruler before him. But he did it at immense cost, financial, spiritual, and human. The country was richer in land, poorer in conscience. Henry VIII remains one of history's most iconic monarchs, a symbol of unchecked power wearing a gold-trimmed doublet. He left behind a transformed England, a shattered religious order, and a warning etched into every pillar of Westminster that kings who make themselves gods often end up broken by their own image. And speaking of breaking things, enter Mary I, Henry's daughter. She didn't just inherit his throne, she inherited his taste for absolutism, his vendettas, and his talent for inspiring both loyalty and fear. And she lit the fires to prove it. 7. Mary I Bloody Mary of England, which's nickname has long eclipsed her real name and her real complexities. Bloody Mary conjures images of flames, martyrs, and vengeful decrees. But behind the burnished legend lies a monarch driven by personal trauma, political fear, and a desperate attempt to restore a world that had already moved on. She wasn't just a zealot. She was a daughter trying to resurrect a father's world with a mother's ghost on her shoulder. Born in 1516 to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary's early life was one of privilege, promise, and careful grooming. That changed when her father annulled his marriage, broke from Rome, and declared Mary illegitimate. She was stripped of her title, separated from her mother, and forced to accept her father's religious reforms, something she resisted at every turn. This wasn't just a family dispute, it was the crucible that shaped her entire reign. When she finally took the throne in 1553, after the brief reign of her Protestant half-brother Edward VI, and the even briefer usurpation by Lady Jane Grey, Mary faced a country teetering between religious identities. The Reformation had taken root. Protestantism was growing, but Mary was a devout Catholic. More than that, she saw her rule as a divine mission to restore the true faith. So she acted hard. She repealed Protestant reforms, reinstated papal authority, and began prosecuting heresy. The result was one of the most infamous periods in English religious history. Over 280 people were burned at the stake, including prominent bishops like Hugh Latimer and Thomas Cranmer. These executions, public and symbolic, were meant to restore orthodoxy. Instead, they cemented her reputation as a fanatic. The term Bloody Mary didn't appear until years later, but the sentiment was immediate. Beyond religion, Mary struggled with governance. She married Philip II of Spain, a union deeply unpopular among her subjects and viewed as a betrayal of English independence. The marriage produced no heir and further alienated her from her people. Her reign saw poor harvests, economic strain, and military blunders, most famously the loss of Calais, England's last possession in France. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Mary's rule was her unfulfilled hope for a child. She experienced multiple false pregnancies, which historians now believe may have been psychological or the result of illness. Each one dashed her hopes of securing a Catholic succession. When she died in 1558, she left no heir, no religious consensus, and a kingdom ready to reverse almost everything she had fought for. Mary I's reign is often reduced to its bloodshed, but that does her a disservice. She was a woman molded by rejection, determined to prove her legitimacy in a world designed to deny it. She was fierce, faithful, and tragically inflexible. Her methods were brutal, her motives sincere, and if Mary's England was lit by fire, her cousin, Elizabeth, would cool it with political frost. But before the Virgin Queen could steady the ship, one more French monarch was preparing to bankrupt a country with nothing but gold, mirrors, and divine delusion. The Sun King was rising, and Louis XIV did not believe in limits. 8. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he was France. At least that's what he said. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. It's the kind of quote that would be too on the nose in a political satire, but Louis wasn't being ironic. He believed it. And for over 72 years, the longest reign of any monarch in European history, he acted like it. From the golden halls of Versailles to the blood-soaked battlefields of his endless wars, Louis turned kingship into spectacle, theatre, and performance art. It was beautiful, it was extravagant, it was unsustainable. Louis became king in 1643 at the age of 4, after the death of his father, Louis XIII. For much of his early reign, power was exercised by Cardinal Mazarin, his chief minister. But when Mazarin died in 1661, Louis took the reins and never let go. He centralized the government, weakened the nobility, and created a court culture so rigid and ritualized that sneezing out of turn could ruin your career. Nobles competed for the privilege of handing the king his shirt. That wasn't just vanity, it was strategy. Louis made himself the sun around which every aristocrat had to orbit. He kept them close and powerless. His most visible achievement, and one of France's most opulent disasters, was the Palace of Versailles. What started as a humble hunting lodge was transformed into a marble and gold monstrosity with over 2,300 rooms, sprawling gardens, elaborate fountains, and a hall of mirrors that could blind a modest man with its symbolism alone. Versailles wasn't just a residence, it was propaganda in stone and glass. It said, "I'm not just your king, I am your destiny. I am your lifestyle brand." Meanwhile, Louis pursued wars like a man running out of calendar space. The War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. He launched campaign after campaign in the name of glory, dynasty, and ego. The early victories were impressive, the later ones less so. By the time he was done, France was militarily exhausted, economically strained, and spiritually divided. And let's talk money. Louis taxed the poor to fund his wars and palaces, while allowing the nobles and clergy to remain largely exempt. The gap between Versailles and the French countryside wasn't just symbolic, it was cavernous. While he threw masquerade balls, many of his subjects starved. Bread riots began decades before the Revolution, and the seeds of 1789 were planted firmly in the shadow of Louis XIV's marble colonnades. Religiously, Louis wasn't content to be just the secular head of state. He also positioned himself as a defender of Catholic orthodoxy. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted rights to Protestants. Thousands of Huguenots fled France, many of them skilled workers and artisans. It was a move that pleased the church and gutted the economy. Despite all this, Louis died in his bed at the age of 76, having outlived most of his heirs and almost all of his enemies. His final years were marked by personal loss, military failure, and growing public disillusionment. But the image remained, the king in high heels and powdered wigs, radiating power like a second sun. Louis XIV was not cruel in the Caligula sense. He didn't delight in death or chaos. His sin was grandeur, unmeasured, unchecked, and ultimately corrosive. He believed France needed a god king. What it really needed was bread. And if Louis XIV believed in power as performance, his great-grandson, Louis XV, believed in power as pleasure. Where the Sun King tried to be a deity, Louis XV was content being the world's most decadent absentee landlord. 9. Louis XV of France. Louis XV inherited one of the most powerful thrones in Europe and slowly, lazily squandered nearly every ounce of its prestige. Reigning from 1715 to 1774, Louis presided over a France drifting into crisis, a kingdom bloated with debt, and a monarchy becoming increasingly irrelevant. He wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't even particularly cruel. His greatest sin was neglect, a king who mistook comfort for competence and indulgence for governance. Louis became king at the age of 5, following the death of his great-grandfather Louis XIV. His regency was handled by Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, and his early years gave France hope. He was handsome, intelligent, and capable, at least on paper. But once he took full control of the throne, the promise began to fade. He lacked the work ethic of his predecessor and the vision to address France's growing problems. What he didn't lack was appetite for leisure, for luxury, and for mistresses. Enter Madame de Pompadour, one of the most influential women in 18th century France. She wasn't just a lover. She was a political player, an advisor, and the de facto minister of taste. Under her guidance, the court became an opulent salon of philosophy, art, and sensuality. Rococo architecture flourished. Fashion reached dizzying heights of absurdity. But while Versailles glittered, the rest of France groaned. Louis XV didn't just ignore reform, he actively avoided it. France's tax system was a mess. Nobles and clergy were largely exempt, and the burden fell on the peasants. Attempts at reform were either blocked by the parlements, judicial courts, or half-heartedly enforced. Meanwhile, the monarchy continued to spend as if Versailles had its own central bank. Military ventures drained the treasury further, particularly the disastrous 7 Years' War, which saw France lose most of its overseas empire, including Canada and India. The king's reputation took a nosedive. Once nicknamed Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, he eventually became known more for his liaisons than his leadership. Courtiers whispered, philosophers scoffed, the people muttered. In 1757, an assassination attempt was made by a disgruntled domestic servant named Robert François d'Amiens, a clear sign that royal reverence was fading. Though the attempt failed, the message landed: the king was no longer sacred. Toward the end of his reign, Louis grew increasingly withdrawn. He turned to religion, dismissed Pompadour's successor, Madame du Barry, and attempted mild reforms, too little, too late. When he died of smallpox in 1774, his body was rushed out of Versailles under cover of night, jeered by commoners as it passed. It was an ignoble end for a monarch who had once inspired such high hopes. Louis XV didn't destroy France, but he weakened every beam supporting the monarchy. His detachment, his decadence, and his inertia set the stage for the firestorm that would erupt under Louis XVI. In the court of public opinion, Louis XV was the monarch who proved that doing nothing can be just as dangerous as doing too much. And speaking of public opinion, our next royal didn't just fall from grace, she was pushed, quite literally, to the scaffold. Marie Antoinette's name became a byword for aristocratic obliviousness. But was she a villain or just a symbol caught in the crossfire? 10. Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette didn't coin the phrase, "let them eat cake," but she never quite lived it down either. The last queen of France before the Revolution, Marie has been remembered as a powdered, perfumed emblem of everything wrong with monarchy: lavish spending, tone-deaf extravagance, and a general inability to read the room. But the truth, as usual, is messier than the myth, and perhaps even more damning. Born an Austrian archduchess in 1755, Marie married the future Louis XVI at age 14 as part of a diplomatic alliance. From the start, she was resented by the French public. As a foreigner, and an Austrian no less, she was viewed with suspicion. When she failed to produce an heir quickly, she was mocked. When she began spending heavily on fashion, parties, and personal retreats like the Petit Trianon, she was vilified. Was she unusually decadent by royal standards? Perhaps not. Versailles was a circus of wealth and one-upmanship. But Marie stood out. She embraced new trends with gusto. Towering wigs, extravagant gowns, theatrical amusements. She held masked balls, gambled and staged peasant-themed plays in her mock village where she and her friends pretended to be milkmaids in silk slippers. It was escapism, not malice, but it looked obscene in a country where bread was becoming a luxury. By the 1780s, France was spiraling into financial crisis. War debts, tax inequality, and inflation bred unrest. And Marie Antoinette became the perfect scapegoat. Pamphlets portrayed her as a seductress, a foreign agent, a spendthrift, and a corrupting force over the king. The infamous diamond necklace scandal, in which she was falsely implicated in a massive fraud, did irreparable damage to her image, even though she had nothing to do with it. Truth didn't matter, the myth had taken root. As the revolution gained momentum, Marie's tone remained tragically aloof. While reformers demanded concessions, she urged her husband to hold firm. She reached out to foreign powers for support. She trusted the court system. All of it failed. By 1791, the royal family attempted to flee, a disastrous move that ended in their arrest and loss of what little credibility they had left. In 1793, following the execution of Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette was put on trial. The charges were wild, exaggerated, and often baseless, but the verdict was never in doubt. She was found guilty and executed by guillotine at the age of 37. Marie Antoinette wasn't evil. She was a symptom, a symbol of a monarchy too disconnected to notice the ground crumbling beneath its feet. Her tragedy wasn't that she lived extravagantly, it's that she never understood why that mattered. And while Marie's obliviousness cost her life, the next royal on our list weaponized ignorance into tyranny. Ferdinand VII of Spain didn't just ignore reform, he rolled it back, locked it up, and threw away the key. 11. Ferdinand VII of Spain. If history had a rewind button, Ferdinand VII of Spain would have hit it so hard he'd have broken the machine. Twice. He wasn't just resistant to change, he treated progress like a personal insult. In a century defined by revolutions, liberalism, and the slow death of absolute monarchy, Ferdinand decided to double down on the past, and then dig it up, and then sit on the throne atop its dusty bones. He first came to power in 1808, but the story wasn't simple. Nothing in early 19th century Spain was. Ferdinand had originally been pushed into power by a court coup against his father, Charles IV, but Napoleon Bonaparte had other plans. Within months, both Charles and Ferdinand had abdicated under pressure from Napoleon, who installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. That led to a full-blown national crisis, the Peninsular War, a brutal guerrilla conflict, and years of political chaos. During Napoleon's occupation, Spain became a battleground, not just between France and resistance forces, but between competing ideas of governance. In 1812, while Ferdinand was held in exile, a liberal faction of Spanish leaders drafted the Cádiz Constitution, a groundbreaking document establishing constitutional monarchy, civil liberties, and limits on royal authority. But when Napoleon fell and Ferdinand was restored to the throne in 1814, he returned not as a humbled monarch or a reform-minded ruler, but as a reactionary wrecking ball. He ripped up the constitution, abolished the new laws, reinstated absolute monarchy, and declared that all reforms made during his absence were null and void. Spain, in his view, had taken a wrong turn while he was away, and it was his divine duty to drive it backwards. That act of royal whiplash earned him the nickname the Desired, ironically at first, then bitterly. His reign became a revolving door of repression. Liberals were jailed, protesters silenced, military coups attempted and crushed. In 1820, he was briefly forced to reinstate the constitution after a successful revolution, but by 1823, with help from French troops, he restored his absolute rule once again. The pattern was clear. Every step forward would be met with two stomps back. Economically, Spain suffered. Colonial possessions in the Americas declared independence one by one during Ferdinand's reign, and he did little to stop it beyond issuing proclamations and dispatching doomed military expeditions. By the time he was done, Spain had lost nearly all of its overseas empire. The Bourbon monarchy remained, but the Spanish crown's global relevance was shattered. Ferdinand's final act of sabotage came in the form of succession drama. With no male heir, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, allowing his daughter, Isabella II, to inherit the throne. That move enraged his brother Don Carlos and sparked decades of civil war known as the Carlist Wars. In short, Ferdinand managed to alienate liberals, conservatives, reformers and absolutists, all within one lifetime. He died in 1833, unloved by liberals, mistrusted by reactionaries, and remembered by most as the man who slammed the brakes on a country already running behind. His reign wasn't just ineffective, it was aggressively counterproductive. He treated constitutionalism like a disease, liberty like a prank, and compromise like treason. But Ferdinand's backward march pales next to the horrors committed in a different European palace, one owned by a man who didn't just exploit a colony. He drained it, tortured it, erased millions in the name of private profit. Meet Leopold II of Belgium, not a king but a corporation in human form. 12. Leopold II of Belgium. If history were a crime scene, King Leopold II of Belgium would be the figure lingering just outside the spotlight, smiling, well-dressed, and drenched in someone else's blood. Unlike other monarchs who inherited imperial systems, Leopold built one from scratch, and he didn't build it for Belgium. He built it for himself. Leopold reigned from 1865 to 1909, but his most infamous chapter began in the 1880s when he set his eyes on Africa. At the time, European powers were scrambling to carve up the continent under the guise of civilization. But Leopold wanted more than a colony. He wanted a personal empire, so through a complex web of diplomacy, deception, and faux humanitarian rhetoric, he secured control of the Congo Free State, not as a Belgian colony, but as his private possession. He convinced Europe and the United States that he was embarking on a noble mission to end the slave trade and bring civilization to Central Africa. In reality, he established one of the most brutal and exploitative regimes the world has ever seen. The Congo Free State wasn't run by Belgium, but by Leopold's private army and concessionary companies. The main goal, extract rubber, and human lives were the fuel. Villages were forced into quotas. Entire communities were punished when production dropped. Hostages were taken. Men were killed or mutilated. Women and children were terrorized. Enforcement was carried out by the Force Publique, a private military made up of European officers and conscripted African soldiers, who were tasked with maintaining order through sheer terror. And all of it was hidden behind a curtain of bureaucratic euphemism and international spin. Back in Europe, Leopold cultivated the image of a benevolent monarch. He funded public works in Belgium, parks, museums, urban beautification projects, all financed with wealth extracted from the Congo. He even presented himself as a philanthropist, a patron of progress. It worked for a while, but truth has a habit of surfacing. By the early 20th century, reports began to emerge from missionaries, whistleblowers, and journalists detailing the horrors in the Congo. British diplomat Roger Casement and journalist E.D. Morel led a growing international movement to expose the atrocities. The outcry became too loud to ignore. In 1908, after mounting pressure, the Belgian government officially took control of the Congo, ending Leopold's personal rule. But the damage was done. Historians estimate that millions, possibly up to 10 million, Congolese people died under his reign. The rubber quotas, the forced labor, the systemic terror, all for profit, all under the smiling portrait of a European king. Even after death, Leopold's reputation was debated. Statues of him stood proudly for decades. Some still do, though increasingly stained with paint, protest, and collective memory. Leopold wasn't a monster in the medieval sense. He didn't lose control. He didn't lash out in madness. He was calculated, polished, profitable. He wore his cruelty like a business suit, not personal, just policy. And if Leopold treated empire like a financial instrument, the next monarch treated his throne like a casino. Meet King Farouk of Egypt, the royal playboy who gambled away dignity, power, and his people's patience in one long, greasy spiral of indulgence. 13. King Farouk of Egypt. King Farouk of Egypt didn't fall from grace. He belly-flopped into scandal. Crowned at the age of 16 in 1936, he was hailed as a modernizing monarch with boyish charm and international appeal. But charm doesn't govern a country, and Farouk seemed more interested in collecting stamps, fast cars, and expensive watches than dealing with Egypt's political crisis, British occupation, or rising nationalist movements. In a time when his people wanted leadership, he gave them tabloid headlines. Farouk's reign began with optimism. Young, Western-educated, and a symbolic bridge between old dynasties and new aspirations, he was seen as a potential reformer. Egypt was technically independent, but still under heavy British influence, and many Egyptians hoped Farouk would stand up for sovereignty and modernization. Instead, they got gluttony, in the most literal sense. Farouk developed a reputation for excessive eating, late-night partying, and extravagant spending. He reportedly ordered entire crates of fine food and European goods to be flown in for personal consumption. His waistline expanded as quickly as his reputation shrank. Cartoons depicted him as bloated and indifferent, a man who fed himself while his people went hungry. But Farouk wasn't just decadent, he was impulsive. He gambled recklessly, both in casinos and in politics. He meddled in affairs of state without much strategy. His cabinet appointments were erratic. He alienated allies and flirted with fascist regimes during World War II, a move that soured relations with the Allies. British officials saw him as unreliable. Egyptian nationalists saw him as weak. His personal behavior didn't help. He was known for womanizing, drunken outbursts, and kleptomania. He once allegedly stole a pocket watch from Winston Churchill, not because he needed it, but because he liked it. In another incident, he was caught looting a fire truck during a blaze in Cairo. The King of Egypt pocketing equipment mid-crisis. It would have been funny if it weren't so sad. By the early 1950s, Egypt had had enough. The military, led by a young Gamal Abdel Nasser and Mohammed Naguib, staged a coup in 1952. Farouk, bloated and bewildered, abdicated in favor of his infant son and was exiled to Italy. He took with him hundreds of suitcases, luxury cars, and enough gold to weigh down a small yacht. He lived out his days in Europe, still indulging, still pretending, until his death in 1965, reportedly at a restaurant table surrounded by food. Farouk's downfall wasn't violent. It was pathetic. He didn't rule like a tyrant. He drifted like a tourist, confused about why his passport still mattered. In the end, Egypt didn't just reject him. It rejected monarchy itself. And while Farouk frittered away a kingdom, the next queen ruled with an iron fist wrapped in paranoid silk. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar didn't waste time with charm. She ruled with brutal calculation and made colonial invaders think twice. 14. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar. If you're looking for the royal equivalent of a locked room full of trapdoors, Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar fits the bill. Known to her enemies and some of her subjects as the Mad Queen of Madagascar, her reign from 1828 to 1861 is one of the most chilling chapters in the annals of monarchy. But unlike Farouk's gluttony or Louis XIV's pageantry, Ranavalona's particular brand of tyranny was rooted in fear, not fear of others, but fear for her rule. Born a commoner, Ranavalona rose to power not through royal blood, but through strategic marriage to King Radamer I. After his death, she seized control in a court coup, outmaneuvering rivals and solidifying her rule with surgical precision. Once enthroned, she took a radically isolationist stance, cutting off European influence, expelling missionaries, and purging foreign customs from her kingdom. On paper, this might read like a bold assertion of independence. In practice, it was more of a paranoid purge. Ranavalona viewed outside influence, especially Christianity, as a direct threat to her rule. She believed, perhaps rightly at first, that European missionaries were attempting to convert her people as a precursor to colonization. So she cracked down, harshly. Converts were punished. Foreigners were expelled. Traditional beliefs were elevated into state ideology, and loyalty was measured not just in words, but in rituals. Refusal could be fatal. The Queen's reign became a reign of fear. Her justice system relied heavily on tangina trials, a traditional ordeal involving poison meant to determine guilt or innocence. Subjects accused of disloyalty, real or imagined, were forced to consume poison as a test of purity. Those who survived were deemed innocent. Many did not. While some of these stories may have been exaggerated by European writers, there's no doubt that life under Ranavalona was dangerous, especially if you were suspected of foreign sympathies, religious deviation, or even just the wrong political alliances. She also employed a vast network of informants and spies. The line between friend and traitor became blurry, and accusations could come from anywhere. This culture of paranoia ensured stability, but at the cost of trust, innovation, and freedom. Her isolationist policies, while temporarily successful in preserving Madagascar's sovereignty, also hindered trade and technological advancement. The country remained independent but stagnant. Still, Ranavalona was no fool. Her rule was strategic, calculated, and deeply rooted in the fear of subversion. And to her credit, Madagascar remained independent throughout her reign, a rarity in 19th century Africa. She outlasted most of her European rivals and left behind a kingdom that had, for better or worse, resisted colonization. But it came at a steep price: fear, repression, and isolation. When she died in 1861, the kingdom was weary, closed off, and divided. Her son, who had more progressive views, would attempt to reverse many of her policies, but the shadow she cast over Madagascar remained long after her death. Ranavalona. I wasn't merely a tyrant. She was a monarch whose obsession with control became her entire personality. In the end, she preserved her throne but froze her country in place. And now, from the highlands of Madagascar to the icy grip of Muscovy, we move to a Tsar whose rage was legend, a man who confused violence for strength and piety for power. Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, didn't just rule with an iron fist. He shattered the mold and forged a throne from fear. 15. Ivan the Terrible of Russia from the IV of Russia didn't earn the nickname the Terrible because he was a little moody on Mondays. He earned it because he practically rewrote the job description of Tsar to include paranoia, terror, and the occasional theatrical meltdown. In Russian, the term Grozny, translated here as terrible, actually means more like formidable or awe-inspiring, but let's not kid ourselves. Ivan was a royal catastrophe in slow motion, and the awe he inspired often came with a prayer for survival. Born in 1530, Ivan ascended the throne officially in 1547, becoming the first ruler to style himself Tsar of all the Russias. But before that, his childhood set the tone for everything to come. His father died when Ivan was just 3. His mother was allegedly poisoned. He grew up surrounded by nobles, the boyars, who fought each other for power, while young Ivan wandered the halls of the Kremlin like a forgotten ghost. When he wasn't being ignored, he was being manipulated. That childhood cocktail of neglect and danger brewed into something cold and volatile, a ruler who would spend his life distrusting everyone and everything, including himself. At first, it seemed Ivan might be a reformer. He established a standing army, introduced a new legal code, and tried to modernize administration. He even held court with intellectuals and foreign envoys, curious about the world beyond Russia's borders. But the thing about Ivan was that everything had an expiration date, especially his patience. When his beloved wife Anastasia died in 1560, something in him snapped. He believed she'd been poisoned by the nobility. Whether she was or not, Ivan chose to believe it. And that belief, like most of his worst decisions, became policy. Enter the Oprichnina, a bizarre, terrifying reign of terror where Ivan carved out a separate domain within Russia, a kind of shadow kingdom ruled directly by him and his personal death squad, the Oprichniki. These men, dressed in black, rode black horses and were given permission to purge, loot, and punish anyone the Tsar saw as a threat. Nobles were tortured, villages were destroyed, and all the while, Ivan vacillated between pious devotion and apocalyptic rage. He saw traitors in every shadow, and when he couldn't find one, he simply made one up. Perhaps the most infamous episode was the massacre of Novgorod in 1570. Believing the city was plotting to defect to Poland, because in Ivan's world everyone was always defecting to Poland, he unleashed his Oprichniki to make an example. Thousands were killed. The city was decimated. It was not strategic. It was not even political. It was personal paranoia manifesting as national tragedy. And then there's the incident that would follow Ivan to the end of his life, the death of his own son and heir, also named Ivan. During an argument, Ivan struck his son, some say with a staff, others with his bare hands, and the young man died from the blow. Whether the act was intentional or accidental is still debated, but what matters more is what it revealed, the depths of Ivan's rage and the consequences of giving that rage a crown. Toward the end of his life, Ivan became increasingly erratic. He alternated between penance and threats, sponsoring church projects one day and imprisoning boyars the next. He died in 1584, reportedly while playing chess, a fitting metaphor for a man who saw his country as a board and its people as pawns. Ivan left behind a Russia that was centralized, feared and scarred. His reign set the stage for centuries of autocracy, and his reputation became legend, not for greatness, but for the terrifying efficiency with which he turned suspicion into statecraft. He proved that a crown worn too tightly becomes a vice, and for the next ruler on our list, that vice came in the form of reforms that came with strings attached, reforms that broke bones as often as they fixed systems. Because now we move from Ivan the Terrible to another Russian ruler with a heavy hand and a makeover obsession. Peter the Great wasn't paranoid, he was pushy, and if Ivan built his empire on fear, Peter rebuilt it on forced progress. 16. Peter the Great of Russia. Peter the Great was the kind of monarch who would tear down your house, rebuild it facing west, and then fine you for wearing the wrong beard while living in it. Standing at nearly 7 feet tall, Peter wasn't just physically imposing, he was an imperial battering ram. Where Ivan ruled through terror, Peter ruled through transformation. He didn't merely want to govern Russia, he wanted to reinvent it. with shipyards, science, shaving kits, and a lot of very confused nobles. Born in 1672, Peter co-ruled with his half-brother Ivan V for a while, though Ivan was more figurehead than ruler. It wasn't long before Peter consolidated power and began one of the most aggressive modernization campaigns in European history. He traveled incognito across Europe, known as the Grand Embassy, to study shipbuilding, military tactics, and Western customs. He returned to Russia with new ideas, new ambitions, and a severe allergy to anything remotely medieval. His mission: drag Russia, kicking and screaming, into modernity. This wasn't modernization by suggestion, it was modernization by decree. Peter ordered the construction of a navy from scratch, revamped the army, overhauled the tax system, and even changed the calendar to align with Western Europe. He also founded a brand new capital, St. Petersburg, on a swamp. Tens of thousands of peasants were conscripted to build it, many at the cost of their lives. But for Peter, the city was a symbol of progress. European-facing, forward-looking, and not so coincidentally, far from the traditional centers of Russian power. Peter's reforms reached into every corner of Russian life. He taxed beards to discourage barbaric styles and forced the nobility to adopt European clothing. He restructured the Orthodox Church under state control, turning spiritual authority into another arm of his bureaucracy. He introduced schools, academies, and a civil service based on rank and performance, at least in theory. In practice, it was a lot of marching, paperwork, and nobles pretending to love powdered wigs. But for all his reforms, Peter wasn't exactly gentle. He viewed dissent not as feedback, but as sabotage. Rebellions, like the Streltsy uprising, were crushed with brutal efficiency. Political enemies were executed, sometimes publicly. Even his own family wasn't safe. His son, Alexei, resisted Peter's reforms and fled abroad. When Peter tracked him down and dragged him back to Russia, the consequences were fatal. Alexei was imprisoned, tortured, and died under mysterious, but clearly unpleasant, circumstances. Peter's personal life was equally stormy. He was known for violent outbursts, crude humor, and an obsession with work. He held mock funerals, staged absurd court rituals, and enjoyed humiliating his courtiers just to remind them who was in charge. He once reportedly forced nobles to drink until they passed out, then doused them with cold water, just to do it again. In Peter's world, discipline and absurdity lived side by side, and everyone else had to keep up or be left behind. Despite the chaos, Peter did succeed in making Russia a major European power. He defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, giving Russia access to the Baltic Sea. He expanded the empire, centralized authority, and laid the foundations for a modern state. But the price was steep: cultural whiplash, overworked peasants, and a nobility caught between fear and flattery. Peter the Great died in 1725, leaving behind a legacy as complex as the reforms he enforced. He dragged Russia into the Enlightenment with both hands, but he did it by turning progress into a punishment. His vision of modernization was as much about obedience as it was about evolution. And speaking of enlightened despotism, our next royal jerk wore the Enlightenment like a costume, all wit and sophistication on the outside, but ruthlessly self-serving underneath. Catherine the Great ruled with charm and cunning, but don't be fooled. Behind the flattering portraits was a monarch who played politics like a long game of chess, and everyone else was a pawn. 17. Catherine the Great of Russia. Catherine the Great loved Enlightenment philosophers, preferably bound in leather and stacked neatly on a shelf next to a loaded pistol and a freshly signed arrest warrant. Her court was a salon of European sophistication, but her politics were pure autocracy in Rococo trim. If Peter the Great forced Russia into modernity with a boot and a beard tax, Catherine followed by giving it manners, Mozart, and moral ambiguity. She called herself a reformer, and she was, just not when it counted most. Born a minor German princess named Sophie, Catherine married into the Russian royal family and wasted no time studying her new home. Her husband, Peter III, was unpopular. Think of him as a kind of reverse lottery ticket for the Russian nobility. Lucky to have, better to discard. Just 6 months into his reign, Peter was overthrown in a coup that conveniently placed Catherine on the throne. Whether or not she orchestrated the whole affair, and plenty of evidence says she did, she knew how to use power once she had it. Catherine declared herself Empress of all the Russias and immediately began branding herself as a child of the Enlightenment. She corresponded with Voltaire, admired Diderot, and even wrote plays. She promoted education, secularized church lands, and opened schools for girls, at least those of noble blood. Her court glittered with intellectuals, musicians, and European visitors who described her as charming, sharp-witted, and remarkably well-informed. But Catherine's embrace of liberal ideals had clear limits. She believed in reform from above, as long as it didn't shake the base of her throne. Serfdom, she philosophized about its cruelty, but under her rule it expanded, deepened, and grew more brutal. Nobles were granted more control over their serfs, not less. When Pugachev's rebellion, a massive peasant uprising, threatened her rule in the 1770s, she didn't see it as a call for reform. She saw it as confirmation that the lower classes needed stronger chains, not fewer. She also expanded Russia's borders through military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering, most notably taking parts of Poland and annexing Crimea. Her empire grew, so did her court. But beneath the polished exterior, power remained personal. Catherine ruled like a chess master, always calculating, always aware of who was watching. Allies were elevated, enemies were exiled. Even her lovers were often political appointments. A favorite could go from boudoir to battlefield, and back again, depending on their loyalty and usefulness. Catherine also launched the Legislative Commission in 1767 to codify Russian law, a sweeping and seemingly progressive move. She circulated a document known as the Nakaz, which advocated for laws based on reason, equality before the law, and humanitarian values. It sounded great on paper. It also went nowhere. The commission was eventually dissolved, having accomplished little beyond providing Catherine with a reputation as a thoughtful reformer. She knew how to perform virtue without sacrificing power. When the French Revolution erupted, she dropped Enlightenment ideals like a hot coal and began censoring foreign literature, arresting radicals, and cracking down on dissent. So much for liberty, equality, and fraternity. Catherine the Great died in 1796 after 34 years on the throne. By then, she had modernized Russia's administration, expanded its territory, and turned the Russian court into one of the most sophisticated in Europe. But her legacy is a study in contradictions. A liberal mind with an iron will, a patron of progress who reinforced feudal chains, and a self-styled philosopher queen who governed like a strategist in an endless war. And if Catherine ruled through charm and calculation, her successor was all impulse and insecurity. Paul I of Russia didn't just fail to live up to his mother's image. He spent most of his reign trying to erase it. What followed was a short, twitchy tenure full of erratic rules, paranoid decrees, and enough petty power plays to exhaust even the most devoted courtiers. May 18. Paul I of Russia. Imagine inheriting one of the largest empires in the world from one of the most iconic rulers in European history, and deciding your first priority is to throw out all her furniture. That was Paul I's Catherine the Great's son, who ascended the throne in 1796, seemed less interested in leading Russia than in undoing whatever his mother had done. If Catherine's court was polished, Paul's was prickly. Where she had ruled with poise, he ruled with paranoia. To understand Paul's reign is to understand a man who never felt he truly belonged on the throne, even when it was handed to him. He had lived most of his life under Catherine's shadow, resenting her power, her policies, and especially her decision to sideline him politically. He saw himself as the rightful heir, waiting decades for a chance to correct the decay he believed she had allowed. Once crowned, he wasted no time making changes, but few of them were inspiring. Most were personal, all were peculiar. Paul's approach to governance was a blend of micromanagement and moral crusade. He obsessed over military discipline, issuing detailed regulations about uniforms, parades, and facial hair. Officers could be punished for wearing the wrong buttons. He restructured the army in ways that mimicked 18th century Prussia, down to absurd minutiae that left generals baffled and soldiers exhausted. This wasn't reform, it was cosplay with consequences, and his domestic policies were equally bewildering. He reversed many of Catherine's foreign alliances, cozying up to Austria and turning cold toward France, a dramatic pivot in the age of Napoleon. At home, he cracked down on noble privilege and imposed strict censorship. He even tried to limit serf labor to 3 days a week, an idea that sounded noble but wasn't enforced, and served mostly to irritate the aristocracy. His reign was one long list of grand announcements followed by erratic enforcement. Paul's court, too, became a theatre of suspicion. He believed in absolute obedience and often punished nobles for perceived slights. A sarcastic remark, a delayed bow, or the wrong wardrobe choice could end a career. He banned the use of certain words, decreed bizarre changes to court rituals, and reportedly rearranged government offices based on personal whims rather than practicality. If Catherine's court was an opera, Paul's was a Kafka novel rewritten by a drill sergeant with insomnia. His paranoia extended to family and succession. Fearing that his own sons would overthrow him, Paul passed a new succession law forbidding female rulers and ensuring a strict male line, a reaction not just to Catherine's reign, but to centuries of Russian history that had included strong empresses. His personal insecurity became public policy. Unsurprisingly, Paul's reign didn't inspire much loyalty. Discontent simmered beneath the surface, and in 1801, after just 5 years on the throne, a group of military officers and nobles staged a coup. They confronted him in his bedroom where, in the polite phrasing of history, he died under mysterious circumstances. In truth, they'd had enough of the tyranny of whims. Paul remains one of Russia's strangest monarchs, a man who wanted to be strong but governed from fear, who tried to be moral but ruled through pettiness. His legacy isn't tyranny in the classic sense. It's what happens when a man with unchecked power decides to use it to relitigate personal grudges. His son, Alexander I, would undo many of his policies. His mother, long dead, remained the shadow he could never escape. And speaking of shadows, our next royal jerk ruled under one so large it consumed his entire reign. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, didn't roar like Ivan or push like Peter. He simply watched the world collapse inch by inch and called it God's will. 19. Nicholas II of Russia. Nicholas II wasn't a tyrant exactly. He wasn't a reformer either. He was a monarch out of time, trapped between centuries, sleepwalking toward revolution with a prayer book in one hand and an increasingly irrelevant scepter in the other. As the last Tsar of the Romanov dynasty, Nicholas has been romanticized, pitied, and vilified, sometimes all in the same breath. But what makes him a royal jerk isn't personal cruelty, it's detachment. In a moment that demanded leadership, he offered fatal passivity. Born into opulence in 1868, Nicholas inherited the throne in 1894 after the death of his father, Alexander III. He was ill-prepared by his own admission. His father had ruled with an iron grip, and Nicholas lacked both his strength and his instincts. He was gentle, religious, and painfully indecisive, traits that might have served a smaller nation in a quieter age, but were disastrous for a crumbling empire on the brink of revolution. From the start, Nicholas clung to the belief that he ruled by divine right. He saw himself not as a political actor, but as a spiritual guardian. This belief blinded him to the demands for reform sweeping across Russia at the turn of the 20th century. Industrialization brought urban unrest. Peasants remained in poverty. Intellectuals and workers alike demanded change. Nicholas responded with vague promises, then swiftly retracted them. It became a pattern: delay, deny, repeat. The first real crack came in 1905, after Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. Protesters marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, hoping to present a petition. The response, known as Bloody Sunday, was a massacre. Nicholas wasn't even in the palace at the time, but the blame fell squarely on his shoulders. He was no longer the little father of the people. He was the man who let the soldiers fire. Under pressure, Nicholas signed the October Manifesto, granting limited civil liberties and establishing the Duma, a parliamentary body. But he never took it seriously. He dissolved it repeatedly when it displeased him, undermining what little credibility he had left. Reform was dangled, then yanked away. It wasn't tyranny in the Ivanhoe IV sense. It was worse, an illusion of hope followed by institutional betrayal. Then came World War I. Nicholas, ever the traditionalist, saw it as a divine crusade and personally took command of the army, despite having no military experience. The results were catastrophic. Russian casualties mounted, supplies ran short, morale collapsed. Meanwhile, back in Petrograd, the real power behind the throne wasn't the Tsar. It was Rasputin, the mystic advisor whose influence over the royal family, particularly the Empress Alexandra, became a national scandal. Nicholas remained serenely unaware. As Russia burned, he wrote tender diary entries about walks in the garden, family dinners, and reading religious texts. His refusal to confront reality wasn't innocence. It was negligence on an imperial scale. By 1917, revolution was inevitable. Faced with mutinies, strikes, and collapsing authority, Nicholas abdicated. He hoped his brother would take the throne. His brother declined. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years old, ended not with a grand final act, but with a confused handoff and an awkward silence. Nicholas II spent his final days in captivity, still convinced of his divine mission. History would later debate his character, but the verdict on his rule is clear. He presided over the end of an empire by refusing to admit it needed saving. He didn't crush dissent. He ignored it. He didn't silence revolution. He pretended it wasn't knocking. And now, from divine delusion to ruthless manipulation, we head east to a palace behind a silk curtain, where an empress turned imperial power into personal theatre. Empress Dowager Cixi didn't rule by right, she ruled by survival, and everyone who underestimated her regretted it. 20. Empress Dowager Cixi of China. Few figures in imperial history have been more divisive or more underestimated than Empress Dowager Cixi. To her critics, she was the scheming concubine who derailed China's progress for half a century. To her admirers, she was the woman who held a crumbling dynasty together through sheer force of will. To this list, she earns her place for the simple reason that no one used power quite like her, ruthlessly, strategically, and almost always for herself. In a world where men ruled with mandate and tradition, Cixi ruled with patience, manipulation, and impeccable timing. She began as a low-ranking concubine to the Xianfeng emperor, but rose quickly through the palace hierarchy by producing something no one else could: a male heir. That child, the future Tongji emperor, became her political lottery ticket. When the emperor died in 1861, Cixi wasn't content with retirement. Along with the Empress Dowager Xian, she launched a palace coup, the Xinyu coup, and removed a regency council that had been assigned to rule in her son's name. With that move, Cixi began what would become one of the longest and most controversial political careers in Chinese history. What followed was a reign behind the throne, not official, not constitutional, but absolute in practice. Cixi controlled the court through alliances, purges, and strategic appointments. She kept rivals in check by playing them against each other and ensured that anyone who forgot her influence quickly remembered. Ministers who overstepped were demoted or quietly sidelined. Reformers who pushed too hard disappeared into retirement. If politics is chess, Cixi played it with the pieces glued to the board. No one moved unless she allowed it. Despite her reputation for reactionary politics, Cixi was not entirely opposed to reform. She occasionally supported modernization when it served her goals, opening arsenals, building railways, dabbling in Western education. But every inch of progress had to pass through her filter, and the moment it threatened her authority, the door slammed shut. Nowhere was this clearer than during the 100 Days Reform in 1898, when a group of intellectuals, backed by the young Guangxu Emperor, attempted to launch sweeping changes to modernize China's institutions. Cixi responded with swift, decisive backlash. The emperor was placed under house arrest. The reformers were arrested or executed. The movement was over in less than 4 months. Cixi returned to power once again, ruling from behind the throne as she had always done, and continued to navigate the stormy waters of a declining Qing Empire. She delayed meaningful reform at nearly every turn, favoring stability over innovation, especially if that innovation threatened the palace's stranglehold on power. The result was a kingdom that teetered on the edge of irrelevance while the rest of the world industrialized, colonized, and globalized without them. One of the most infamous accusations leveled against her is that she misappropriated funds meant for the navy to instead construct a lavish marble boat at the summer palace. Symbolic, certainly. Accurate, debated. But the image of a rigid, immobile vessel made of stone, beautiful and completely useless, became a metaphor for her reign. She could preserve the empire's image, but she could not make it move. Her rule finally ended with her death in 1908, just a day after the death of the Guangxu Emperor, a timing that has never ceased to raise eyebrows. Cixi left behind a child emperor, a bankrupt dynasty, and an empire barely limping into the 20th century. Whatever her personal brilliance or survival instinct, her obsession with control outlived her usefulness. She was never officially the ruler of China, yet for nearly 50 years she dictated its fate. And if Cixi ruled through soft power and palace intrigue, the next emperor on our list ruled through sheer megalomania. Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty didn't just build grand projects, he built them on the backs of exhausted citizens, with a level of delusion so spectacular it makes Versailles look like a humble Airbnb. 21. Emperor Yang of Sui, China. Emperor Yang of Sui had a vision, and it was big. Grand canals, imperial highways, palatial expansions, endless war campaigns. No corner of his empire was too remote to escape his ambition. But ambition without restraint is just a slow-moving disaster in fancy robes. And Yang's reign, 604 to 618 CE, was one long lesson in how to destroy a dynasty faster than you can finish paving the road to it. Officially known as Emperor Yang, his personal name was Yang Guang. He came to power after allegedly scheming against his own father, Emperor Wen, and possibly orchestrating the death of his elder brother to eliminate rivals. Once crowned, Yang inherited a relatively stable and centralized empire. Most rulers would take that as an opportunity to govern wisely. Yang saw it as a blank canvas on which to paint his delusions of grandeur. His greatest project and greatest curse was the Grand Canal. Stretching over 1,000 miles, the canal linked the north and south of China, enabling faster grain transport and military logistics. From a civil engineering standpoint, it was a marvel. From a human standpoint, it was a nightmare. The project required the forced labor of millions of workers who toiled under brutal conditions, often with inadequate supplies and rest. Many died. Yang pressed on, and he didn't stop there. He launched multiple military campaigns, including disastrous invasions of Korea, which drained the treasury and manpower alike. These expeditions weren't born of necessity, but of imperial ego. Victory would have extended his glory. Defeat simply extended his list of enemies. The invasions failed, the losses mounted, and morale plummeted across the empire. Meanwhile, back at home, Yang was busy remodeling cities and expanding palaces. He relocated the capital multiple times, each move requiring massive labor and resources. He increased taxes, conscripted more workers, and maintained an extravagant lifestyle that seemed to mock the growing unrest among his people. He wasn't just out of touch, he was aggressively out of touch, pushing a propaganda vision of imperial prosperity while the countryside starved. The nobles disliked him. The peasants despised him. Even the military, his supposed backbone, grew disillusioned. His obsession with monument building and conquest overrode any semblance of strategic planning or popular support. Rebellions flared across the empire. Rather than address their root causes, Yang doubled down on extravagance and repression. In 618 CE, his own generals had seen enough. Yang was assassinated in a coup led by one of his subordinates while traveling in the south. His death marked the end of the Sui dynasty, a dynasty that had shown enormous promise under his father, only to be undone in a generation by his son's excess. Emperor Yang's legacy is one of catastrophic ambition. He imagined himself a second Qin Shi Huang, uniting and transforming China through sheer will. What he achieved was far more ironic, the complete collapse of a regime under the weight of its own ego. His works remain. The Grand Canal still exists in parts, but the dynasty that funded them does not. And speaking of Qin Shi Huang, we now rewind the clock to meet China's original unifier, a man whose ambition burned hotter, faster, and arguably darker. Qin Shi Huang built an empire with iron fists and immortal dreams, crushing opposition and rewriting the cultural code. And somehow he made Emperor Yang look like a renovation consultant. 22. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, China. Qin Shi Huang is what happens when a conqueror gets bored of war and starts rearranging reality. As the first emperor of a unified China in 221 BCE, he wasn't just a ruler, he was a force of nature. He standardized currency, script, weights, and measures. He connected defensive walls into the first version of the Great Wall. He crushed feudalism, centralized authority, and created a bureaucracy that would shape Chinese governance for millennia. But for all his genius, he was also obsessive, paranoid, and just a little too interested in never dying. Born Ying Zheng, he ascended the throne of the Qin state at the age of 13. By his late 30s, he had defeated the other warring states and declared himself Huangdi, emperor, not king, not ruler, but something divine, something eternal. And once he had all of China under his control, he set out to remake it in his image. Qin Shi Huang wasn't content with unifying borders. He wanted to unify minds. He ordered the burning of books that didn't align with state doctrine, Confucian texts, historical records, anything that suggested alternative models of rule. Scholars who resisted were silenced, exiled, or worse. The goal wasn't just obedience, it was mental standardization. One empire, one thought, one ruler. He built roads, irrigation systems, and massive infrastructure projects, but he also built walls, literal and figurative. The Great Wall was designed to keep out northern invaders, but it also kept in forced laborers who died in droves constructing it. His legal code was draconian, designed for efficiency and control rather than justice. Loyalty was rewarded, but independence was crushed. And then there was the quest for immortality. Obsessed with cheating death, Qin Shi Huang sent emissaries across the sea in search of the mythical elixir of life. Alchemists filled his court with strange potions, many of them toxic. Ironically, some historians believe his obsession with anti-death medicines may have hastened his death. Still, he kept building. His tomb, guarded by the Terracotta Army, was one of the most ambitious burial complexes in world history, a city of clay soldiers, all so he could rule the afterlife as completely as he had ruled the living. His death in 210 BCE was concealed by his advisors for weeks to prevent panic. But the empire he had forged with such intensity began to unravel almost immediately. His son, incapable of holding it together, faced rebellions, and the Qin dynasty collapsed just 4 years later. Qin Shi Huang's legacy is double-edged. He unified China, built a functioning state, and set a bureaucratic precedent still visible today. But he also ruled with a philosophy that saw people as tools and ideas as threats. His reign was efficient but brittle. His reforms were vast but impersonal. He didn't just want power, he wanted permanence. And that craving, more than any rival or rebellion, was what ultimately unraveled his empire. Now that's ambition. And it brings us to the next Roman on our list, a man who didn't just crave power, but reveled in wielding it over those beneath him. If Qin Shi Huang buried scholars alive, Nero Claudius Drusus preferred humiliation in marble halls. 23. Nero Claudius Drusus, Rome. History is a strange mirror. Sometimes it warps the reflection, exaggerating features until they barely resemble the original. Other times, it simply forgets the subject altogether. Nero Claudius Drusus is one of those figures you might know without realizing it. Not to be confused with his more infamous descendant, Emperor Nero. Drusus was the younger brother of Emperor Tiberius, the stepson of Augustus, and the father of Germanicus. In other words, a man born into a dizzying network of dynastic ambition. While not an emperor himself, Drusus carved out his place in history through military conquest, personal arrogance, and a reputation for being more admired than he probably deserved. Let's start with the basics. Drusus was a military commander with a promising career. He led successful campaigns in Germania, pushing the Roman frontier beyond the Rhine and building the kind of military resume that made Augustus smile and his brother Tiberius grind his teeth. He was young, tall, charismatic, and apparently loved by the legions, all things that made him dangerous to anyone who believed in a tightly controlled imperial succession. But charisma is a double-edged sword, especially in Rome. Behind Drusus's shiny public image was a man reportedly driven by ambition and disdain for the very empire he was helping to expand. According to some ancient sources, including Suetonius, Drusus once openly expressed his wish to restore the Roman Republic, a comment that, while theoretically noble, was more likely a jab at Augustus than a genuine political ideology. It's hard to say whether he meant it or was simply venting over dinner, but in Rome, even stray thoughts could get you killed, or at the very least, remembered as a threat. Drusus also had a reputation for treating subordinates with contempt. Some reports describe him as brash, dismissive, and prone to taking credit for the work of others. In the hyper-competitive world of Roman aristocracy, this wasn't exactly a unique flaw, but Drusus carried it with particular arrogance. He allegedly viewed the Senate as ornamental and had little patience for the cautious diplomacy favored by his adoptive father, Augustus. He was also a man of violent temperament. Tacitus hints at his fiery nature and poor judgment during campaigns. His soldiers may have admired his battlefield prowess, but admiration doesn't equal virtue, especially when your victories come with unnecessary bloodshed or reckless overextension of imperial borders. He seemed to thrive on chaos, pushing deeper into enemy territory not necessarily because it made sense, but because it looked impressive. Drusus died in 9 BCE under mysterious circumstances, reportedly after falling from a horse during a campaign in Germania. Tiberius, his older brother, was said to be devastated, though one imagines there was also a quiet sigh of relief behind closed doors. Drusus's death removed a rival from the imperial family tree and set the stage for future dysfunction within the Julio-Claudian dynasty. While he was later lionized by the Roman state, statues erected in his honor, and songs sung of his valor, Drusus's legacy is ultimately that of a what if. What if he had lived? What if he had taken power? What if his contempt for empire had turned into open rebellion? It's tempting to see him as a lost reformer. More likely he would have been just another self-serving noble with a better tailor and a sharper sword. And so Drusus fades into history, not for what he did, but for what he might have become. Arrogant, ambitious, and just charming enough to make you forget the cruelty underneath. But if Drusus was dangerous in the abstract, the next royal jerk on our list was dangerous in the concrete, literally. King Ludwig II of Bavaria built castles so elaborate they bankrupted the state, all while the government quietly tried to figure out whether their monarch had lost his mind or just preferred fantasy to function. 24. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. King Ludwig II of Bavaria was the kind of monarch who made his courtiers whisper and his treasurers weep, known to some as the fairy tale king, and to others as the Mad King. Ludwig ruled from 1864 to 1886, but not in any way that resembled actual governance. Where other kings signed treaties and led armies, Ludwig built castles, not fortresses or military outposts, but dreamlike pastel-colored palaces that looked like the fever dreams of a romantic poet. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, each more ornate and expensive than the last. To understand Ludwig, you have to understand that he never really wanted to rule. He was shy, introverted, and obsessed with art, music, and mythology, especially the operas of Richard Wagner, whom he elevated from a controversial composer to his personal artistic messiah. Ludwig bankrolled Wagner's career, funded the construction of a lavish opera house, and referred to himself in letters using medieval epithets like the Guardian of the Grail. All this might have been harmless eccentricity if he weren't also responsible for a national budget. Early in his reign, Ludwig was seen as promising, even handsome, with the kind of melancholy beauty that lent itself to oil paintings and whispered legend. But as time wore on, it became clear he had little interest in politics. He avoided public appearances, shunned his ministers, and preferred to ride alone through the mountains at night. Cabinet meetings were missed, important legislation sat unsigned. Bavaria wasn't a kingdom to him, it was a stage for his fantasies. And those fantasies were expensive. Ludwig's castles were technological marvels for their time. Central heating, electricity, elevators, but they came with enormous price tags. He borrowed heavily, took loans under false pretenses, and ignored repeated warnings from his ministers. At one point, the king was spending more on personal construction projects than the entire military budget of the kingdom. His obsession with theatricality extended to his own home life. He often dined alone, ordering elaborate multi-course meals to be served on a table that rose through the floor by mechanical lift, so he wouldn't have to interact with servants. By the 1880s, the situation was untenable. Bavaria was drowning in debt, and Ludwig's behavior was becoming erratic. He was reclusive, paranoid, and increasingly detached from reality. His ministers, unable to remove him through legal means, did what any good 19th century cabinet might do. They declared him insane. A team of doctors who had never actually examined him in person signed off on the diagnosis. Ludwig was deposed in 1886. 2 days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg, along with the psychiatrist assigned to watch him. The official report claimed accidental drowning. The conspiracy theories haven't stopped since. Ludwig left behind no children, no legacy of law or diplomacy, just castles. Beautiful, opulent, surreal castles. They would later inspire Disney, become tourist attractions, and help rehabilitate his image as a tragic dreamer. But make no mistake, Ludwig's fantasy came at a cost. He drained Bavaria's coffers, ignored his people, and treated his position not as a responsibility, but as a license for escape. He was a royal jerk of a different kind. Not cruel, not violent, but so profoundly self-absorbed that he abandoned the world in favor of his own. His was a kingdom of mirrors, swans, and golden ceilings, with no room for accountability. And while Ludwig built his fantasy in stone, our next monarch broke reality with confusion. King Christian VII of Denmark didn't design castles or conquer enemies. He simply unraveled, leaving behind a reign so dysfunctional that even his courtiers started running the country without telling him. 25. King Christian VII of Denmark. King Christian VII of Denmark wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He wasn't particularly cruel or power-hungry or even interested in governing. His version of royal jerkery came wrapped in confusion, absent-minded indulgence, and a level of erratic behavior that would make even the most dysfunctional court take notice. Crowned at just 17 in 1766, Christian's reign wasn't so much ruled as tolerated. A strange intermission between functioning monarchs, during which ministers, physicians, and mistresses quietly assumed the throne in everything but name. Christian's instability was evident from the beginning. He was reportedly intelligent as a child, but deeply troubled, prone to mood swings, erratic impulses, and compulsive behavior that unsettled his advisors. Whether due to mental illness, trauma, or the suffocating pressure of court life, by the time he was king, Christian had already started to unravel. His interests included elaborate pranks, wandering the streets at night, and humiliating courtiers. Government meetings bored him. Public ceremonies were a chore. He once interrupted a formal event by loudly mimicking a rooster. At the same time, Denmark was on the brink of modern reform. Enlightenment ideas were sweeping across Europe, and many within Christian's court, particularly the rising middle-class bureaucrats, were eager to modernize laws, reduce noble privileges, and promote public welfare. Unfortunately, their king preferred shadow puppets and gambling. Into this vacuum of authority stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's personal physician. Charismatic, educated, and ambitious, Struensee became Christian's confidant and eventually the de facto ruler of Denmark. For a time, the arrangement worked. Struensee pushed through hundreds of reforms, abolishing torture, liberalizing the press, improving healthcare, and cutting back aristocratic excess. Denmark briefly looked like it might become a model of enlightened monarchy, all under the name of a king who barely noticed. But Struensee's success bred resentment. He alienated the nobility, took too much credit, and most scandalously became romantically involved with Queen Caroline Matilda, Christian's English wife. The affair was widely rumored and not very well hidden. Soon, the court erupted in conspiracy, and in 1772, a palace coup removed Struensee and placed Christian under tight control. Struensee was arrested and executed. The Queen was exiled. The reforms were rolled back, and Christian, he remained on the throne, increasingly sidelined, existing more as a ceremonial fixture than a head of state. For the next several decades, Denmark was effectively ruled by regents and advisors, while Christian drifted in and out of lucidity. He lived a long life, far longer than most expected, and his reign technically lasted over 40 years. But it was a reign in name only. He signed what he was told to sign. He appeared when summoned. He passed into history not as a leader, but as a placeholder. Christian VII wasn't a tyrant, but he left his country in turmoil, led by shadows and scandals. His court became a stage for other people's ambitions, dangerous ones. And while his failures may have been more tragic than malicious, the consequences were real. Reforms delayed, lives ruined, and a monarchy thrown into crisis by a man who never really wanted the crown in the first place. And speaking of kings who did nothing but take up space, in England there was George IV, a monarch so dedicated to self-absorption that even his own family couldn't stand him. If Christian VII neglected power out of confusion, George ignored it out of contempt. 26. George IV of Britain. If you were designing a royal character for a satire, lavishly wasteful, absurdly vain, and drunk on both wine and delusion, George IV would walk in wearing a velvet cape, a diamond-encrusted snuff-box, and about 4 unnecessary titles. His reign, both as Prince Regent and as King, was less a period of leadership and more a long-running public scandal dressed up in ermine. He is often remembered as the king who looked the part, right up until he opened his mouth or sent the bill. George was made Prince Regent in 1811 when his father, George III, was declared mentally unfit to rule. But rather than treat this responsibility with seriousness, George treated it like a long-delayed excuse to indulge himself without parental oversight. He had already spent years accumulating debt, hosting extravagant parties, and offending both Parliament and polite society. As Prince Regent, his appetites only grew. For food, for drink, for clothing, and for luxury homes, including the Orientalist fever dream that is the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Politics bored him. He left the hard work to his ministers, especially Lord Liverpool, while he focused on fashion, mistresses, and avoiding criticism. When the Napoleonic Wars ended and public pressure grew for reform and accountability, George did the royal equivalent of sticking his fingers in his ears. He presented himself as a romantic figure, a patron of the arts, a man of style and sophistication. But most people saw through the performance. His relationship with his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, became one of the most public and petty marital feuds in royal history. George detested her from the start, with some justification to be fair, but instead of handling the matter discreetly, he attempted to ban her from his coronation, pursued legal action against her, and dragged the whole affair through Parliament in what became a grotesque public trial. The public surprisingly took Caroline's side. George, already disliked, became a figure of ridicule. Satirists had a field day. The monarchy lost much of its moral authority. When he finally became king in 1820, George was already physically deteriorating. He was bloated, sickly, and barely able to walk without assistance. Yet he continued to demand flattery, attention, and deference. Ministers tiptoed around his moods. Artists were instructed to idealize his appearance in portraits. He was, quite literally, a king who ruled from a couch, more interested in dinner menus than parliamentary debates. Despite all of this, George IV did leave some cultural legacies. He supported architects like John Nash and helped develop parts of London into the city we recognize today. He collected art, promoted design, and played a part in defining the Regency aesthetic. But these were side effects of his personal vanity, not acts of public service. By the time he died in 1830, few mourned. Even the royal family breathed easier. George IV was the embodiment of monarchy without meaning, a symbol without substance. He wanted to be adored but settled for being tolerated. In the grand ledger of royal jerkdom, he stands as a reminder that excess, laziness, and entitlement can do as much damage as tyranny. And if you think George IV was a disappointment, just wait until you meet his great-great-nephew Edward VIII. A man who looked at an entire empire and said, "I'd rather have a vacation." His reign didn't last long, but the echo of his selfishness still lingers. 27. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. Edward VIII had it all: charm, popularity, a modern media presence, and a clear path to the throne. What he didn't have was patience, responsibility, or any desire to be king in the actual sense of the word. His brief reign in 1936, a mere 11 months, remains one of the most dramatic royal implosions in British history. It wasn't because he was hated, quite the opposite. The public adored him, but Edward adored someone else, Wallis Simpson, and decided she was more important than duty, tradition, or, well, the British Empire. Let's be clear, abdication wasn't the scandal. The real scandal was how much Edward resented the job long before he left it. Even as Prince of Wales, he made it clear that constitutional monarchy bored him. He had little time for paperwork, disdained ceremony, and often refused to read government briefings. He was more comfortable on safari or at high society parties than in parliament or palace meetings. His advisors called him restless. His critics called him lazy. Both were right. When his father, George V, died in January 1936, Edward ascended the throne and immediately made waves by pursuing a marriage to Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. In an age when the Church of England forbade the remarriage of divorced persons while their former spouses lived, Edward's relationship created a constitutional crisis. But rather than navigate the issue with diplomacy, Edward forced the issue. He believed the monarchy should bend to his will, not the other way around. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, refused to support the marriage. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, and others echoed the opposition. Faced with the choice between the crown and his love life, Edward chose the latter. In December 1936, he abdicated the throne, famously declaring, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." It was a romantic line and a historical dodge, because here's the truth: Edward didn't abdicate out of selfless love. He abdicated because he wasn't interested in serving. He wanted the title, the privilege, and the freedom, but not the accountability. And what followed didn't exactly help his legacy. As the Duke of Windsor, Edward lived in luxurious exile with Wallis, drifting between Europe and the Bahamas, occasionally popping up in headlines, often for the wrong reasons. Worse, he had a troubling fondness for authoritarian regimes. During a 1937 visit to Germany, he met Adolf Hitler, gave Nazi salutes, and spoke favorably of order and stability. British intelligence monitored his correspondence during World War II, concerned about his loyalties. Some historians believe the government sent him to the Bahamas during the war, not as a diplomatic appointment, but as a form of containment. Edward VIII's legacy isn't a love story, it's a cautionary tale. A monarch who treated the throne like an inconvenience, who mistook personal freedom for leadership, and who left behind a vacuum that his brother, the reluctant George VI, would have to fill under the weight of war. He wasn't tragic. He was selfish. He wasn't forced to leave. He chose to. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the most dangerous kind of royal isn't the tyrant or the fool, it's the one who simply walks away. 28. Prince Philip, consort of Elizabeth II. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had one of the longest royal tenures in modern history, over 7 decades at the side of Queen Elizabeth II. He was a war hero, a staunch supporter of royal tradition, and a deeply influential figure in shaping the modern monarchy. He was also, quite famously, a walking gaffe machine, a man who seemed to treat public engagements as opportunities for offhand remarks, many of which landed like a brick through a stained glass window. Let's be clear, Prince Philip wasn't a despot, nor was he interested in running the country. He understood his constitutional role well, which was largely to walk 2 steps behind the Queen and never cause a constitutional crisis. He succeeded at that. What makes him land on this list isn't a legacy of cruelty or greed, but rather a long history of behavior that was at times astonishingly tone-deaf, abrasively blunt, and casually elitist. If there were a competition for most awkwardly delivered opinions in a tuxedo, Philip would have retired the trophy decades ago. Born into Greek and Danish royalty, Philip's early life was filled with upheaval. His family was exiled from Greece, he served in the Royal Navy, and by the time he married Elizabeth in 1947, he had already renounced his titles and adopted British citizenship. He was, in many ways, a modern prince, a man raised in old-world tradition but thrust into a very different post-war reality. And it showed. Philip didn't much care for political correctness. He spoke his mind, often in places where decorum was expected. His list of infamous comments is almost folkloric. To British students in China, "If you stay here much longer, you'll all be slitty-eyed." To a woman in Kenya, "You are a woman, aren't you?" To an Aboriginal Australian, "Do you still throw spears at each other?" These weren't strategic blunders or slips of the tongue. They were habits, the off-the-cuff quips of a man who didn't feel the need to filter. Defenders say he was simply old-fashioned. Critics say he embodied the worst kind of institutional arrogance, the assumption that rank excuse is offence. And the truth, as usual, sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Philip wasn't malicious. He was simply insulated, blunt, and often unaware of the impact of his words. That might not make him history's greatest villain, but it does make him a textbook example of how unchecked entitlement can become normalized, especially when worn under medals and pearls. Despite all this, Philip was deeply loyal to his wife and family. He championed causes like conservation, engineering and youth development through the Duke of Edinburgh's award. He modernized palace operations, pushed for televised royal events, and often served as a grounding force in moments of royal crisis. He was, by all accounts, a private man forced to play a very public role, and not always gracefully. His legacy is complicated. Revered by many, ridiculed by others, he represents the kind of royal who doesn't rule but still leaves a very public footprint. He didn't seek power, but he wielded influence. And sometimes that influence sounded a lot like a dinner guest who couldn't read the room. But if Prince Philip was problematic in a harmless uncle-at-Christmas kind of way, his son, Prince Andrew, took the royal jerk mantle into much darker territory. If Philip said the wrong thing, Andrew was often caught doing the wrong thing at the worst possible time. 29. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, has become one of the most publicly disgraced members of the British royal family in modern times. A fall from grace so complete, it feels less like a scandal and more like a slow-motion implosion. Once styled as the Queen's favourite, Andrew's transformation from decorated naval officer to tabloid mainstay has been fuelled by entitlement, arrogance, and a seemingly bottomless capacity for poor judgment. Early in life, Andrew seemed poised for a respectable royal career. He served in the Royal Navy with distinction, even participating in the Falklands War. For a while, he carried the image of the handsome, daring prince, less stuffy than Charles, more telegenic than Edward. But by the 1990s, that image began to fray. He was nicknamed Air Miles Andy for his frequent use of taxpayer-funded travel, often for personal reasons. His lifestyle, flashy, luxurious, and largely unaccountable, didn't go unnoticed by the press or the public. Then came the associations that would define and derail his legacy, chief among them his friendship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Even after Epstein's first conviction, Andrew continued to meet with him, socialize with him, and even stay at his homes. When Epstein was arrested again in 2019, scrutiny of Andrew's ties to him intensified. The final blow came with a BBC interview that was meant to clear Andrew's name and did exactly the opposite. The 2019 Newsnight interview was a masterclass in how not to conduct damage control. Andrew denied accusations of wrongdoing with such detachment and bizarre detail, including claiming he couldn't sweat due to a medical condition. That the public reaction was swift and brutal. He showed no remorse, no self-awareness, and certainly no understanding of the gravity of the situation. The palace quickly stripped him of his royal duties. His public appearances vanished. His legal troubles remained. What makes Andrew's behavior so damning isn't just the allegations, which he has denied, but his consistent failure to acknowledge the dignity of the role he was born into. He behaved like royalty without responsibility. He expected deference while giving none, and he treated his station not as a platform for service, but as a cushion for personal indulgence. Even as public trust in the monarchy faced challenges, Andrew's conduct became a lightning rod for criticism, a reminder of how unaccountable power can still exist in a supposedly modern institution. By the time he reached a legal settlement in early 2022, his place in royal life had effectively collapsed. The titles remained technically, the relevance did not. Andrew's story isn't just one of personal disgrace, it's a mirror held up to the institution itself, a warning about what happens when legacy becomes license. He wanted the perks of royalty without the burden, and when reality arrived, it wasn't with a crown, it was with a reckoning. And while Andrew's scandals are very modern, our next royal jerk took entitlement to its theological extreme. King Charles I of England didn't just believe he had the right to rule, he believed God had personally signed off on it. Spoiler, Parliament disagreed. 30. King Charles I of England. King Charles I of England wasn't born to be a villain. He was born to be a king, the second son of James I, shy, devout and meticulous. Unfortunately, he also inherited a deeply fractured political system, an inflated sense of divine authority, and the communication skills of a particularly offended statue. His reign ended in civil war, chaos, and, uniquely for an English monarch, execution. But long before the axe fell, Charles earned his royal jerk badge through a combination of stubbornness, elitism, and breathtaking political tone-deafness. From the beginning, Charles saw kingship not as a job, but as a calling, one that placed him above the grubby complications of Parliament or popular opinion. He married a Catholic French princess, Henrietta Maria, which raised Protestant eyebrows. He imposed taxes without consent, dismissed critics, and relied heavily on a small circle of advisers who shared his disdain for compromise. Most infamously, Charles ruled without Parliament for 11 years, a period known as the personal rule. During this time, he used loopholes and arcane laws to raise money, such as the much-resented ship money, a medieval tax designed for coastal defence that he applied to inland counties. It was legal, it was also deeply unpopular, and it reinforced the growing sense that Charles saw England as a divine inheritance rather than a shared enterprise. His religious policies only worsened things. Charles, along with his Archbishop William Laud, tried to impose uniform Anglican practices across England and Scotland. The Scots, being particularly unamused by the idea of royal meddling in their churches, revolted. That revolt forced Charles to recall Parliament to raise funds, and once Parliament had returned, they weren't exactly in the mood to forgive and forget. What followed was a slow-motion breakdown of authority. Distrust festered. Charles tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament, a move so brazen it stunned even his supporters. By 1642, civil war was inevitable. Royalists, the Cavaliers, fought parliamentarians, the Roundheads, in a brutal conflict that tore the kingdom apart. Charles wasn't a battlefield commander, he left most of that to others, but he remained the spiritual head of a cause that increasingly felt like a sinking ship. Even after defeat, Charles refused to compromise. He negotiated in bad faith, played his enemies against one another, and clung to the belief that his kingship was divinely ordained. Eventually, even his captors lost patience. In 1649, he was tried for treason, found guilty, and executed, an unthinkable act that stunned Europe. A king executed by his own people? It was less revolution and more exorcism. Charles I's tragedy was self-made. He wasn't bloodthirsty, he wasn't a tyrant in the mold of ancient emperors, but he was arrogant, inflexible, and convinced of his own righteousness. He mistook silence for loyalty, prayer for governance, and tradition for immunity. And his execution didn't just end a reign, It ended the idea that monarchs ruled by divine right, unchallenged and unaccountable. His death sent shockwaves through the monarchy, ones that would echo through the reigns of his children, his enemies, and every royal jerk who dared confuse the crown with a divine guarantee. 31. King Charles II of Spain, the Bewitched. There are royal tragedies, and then there's Charles II of Spain, a walking, talking, state-funded medical emergency who somehow ruled a global empire while barely being able to function. Known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, Charles was the last Habsburg king of Spain, and by the time he took the throne, his family tree had looped so tightly in on itself it practically formed a noose. If the Habsburgs were famous for their strategic marriages, Charles II was the cautionary punchline. Born in 1661, Charles was a product of generations of inbreeding designed to preserve royal bloodlines. The result? A monarch so physically and intellectually stunted that even contemporary courtiers were unsure how he remained alive, let alone in charge. He suffered from numerous congenital issues, a large protruding jaw that made speech and eating difficult, developmental delays, chronic illness, and infertility. He was weak, frail, and easily manipulated, a boy king who never fully grew into either word. And yet he ruled, or more accurately, he was ruled through. His mother, Mariana of Austria, served as regent for much of his early reign and continued to exert influence long after. Ministers, nobles, foreign ambassadors, and palace favourites took turns steering the monarchy, while Charles wandered aimlessly through the corridors of power, often unaware of the deals being struck in his name. The Spanish Empire by this point was in steep decline. Its economy was battered, its territories under threat, and its institutions bloated with inefficiency. Charles II tragically wasn't equipped to reverse the trend. He couldn't lead an army, negotiate treaties, or even produce an heir. Spain needed a miracle. It got a monarch who needed supervision. In the final years of his life, Charles became increasingly obsessed with the idea that he was cursed. He commissioned exorcisms. He sought out spiritual healers. He blamed sorcery for his body's failings and his country's decline. And to be fair, it probably felt that way. How else could he explain his life marred by constant illness, political humiliation, and dynastic failure? The real crisis came with succession. Charles had no children and no clear successor. His death would leave a vacuum, and every major European power wanted to fill it. His final act was to name Philip of Anjou, grandson of France's Louis XIV, as his heir. That decision sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal continent-wide conflict over who got to inherit a broken empire. Charles II died in 1700 at the age of 38, physically wrecked and politically irrelevant. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line and served as a grim monument to the dangers of dynastic isolation. His reign was less about cruelty and more about absence. The absence of leadership, the absence of heirs, the absence of a functioning monarchy. And if Charles II was a victim of royal dysfunction, the next monarch weaponized it. Queen Isabella II of Spain didn't merely inherit a troubled throne, she turned it into her personal theatre of favoritism, corruption and scandal. 32. Queen Isabella II of Spain. Queen Isabella II of Spain wasn't the worst monarch in history, but she might be one of the most exasperating. Crowned as a child and ruling during one of the most volatile periods in Spain's political evolution, she spent decades turning a fragile monarchy into a scandal-ridden carousel of favoritism, factionalism, and profoundly bad taste. Her reign was less a tragedy and more a series of self-inflicted wounds dressed in lace. Isabella ascended to the throne in 1833 at the age of 3, following the death of her father, King Ferdinand VII. Her claim triggered the First Carlist War, as supporters of her uncle Carlos contested the legitimacy of a female monarch. From the start, Isabella's rule was defined by division: liberals versus conservatives, monarchists versus republicans, modernizers versus nostalgists. But instead of uniting these factions, or at least playing them against one another with strategic savvy, Isabella mostly ignored them, unless they were useful for her own comfort. By the time she came of age and assumed full control in 1843, Isabella had already been shaped by the palace culture of backstabbing and bribery. Rather than rise above it, she embraced it. Her court became infamous for nepotism, corruption, and constant ministerial turnover. Governments fell with dizzying speed. Ministers were appointed not for their skill, but for their loyalty or their ability to amuse the Queen. Policy became secondary to patronage. Stability became impossible. Her personal life didn't help matters. Isabella was pushed into a political marriage with her cousin, Francisco de Assis, a union that was diplomatically useful but personally and emotionally disastrous. The Queen reportedly disliked her husband intensely and surrounded herself with favourites, both male and female, whose influence over court and policy became the stuff of tabloid legend. Whether these relationships were romantic, platonic, or strategic hardly mattered. They created a perception that the Queen was impulsive, unserious, and easily swayed. Worse, Isabella seemed to treat the Spanish crown as a private estate. While the country suffered economically and politically, she maintained an extravagant lifestyle. She toured religious sites, built lavish palaces, and involved herself in church affairs, often using Catholicism as a political crutch while failing to address the more pressing issues of governance. She played both sides of the ideological fence, supporting conservatives when convenient, then flipping to liberalism when it suited her, alienating everyone in the process. By the 1860s, Spain was exhausted. Revolutions, military uprisings, and endless political squabbling eroded whatever faith remained in the monarchy. In 1868, the Glorious Revolution forced Isabella into exile. She abdicated in favor of her son, Alfonso XII, but the damage had already been done. The monarchy, once fragile, was now radioactive. Isabella II's reign is remembered not for tyranny or innovation, but for missed opportunities and chaotic misrule. She was a queen who mistook her crown for a tiara, ornamental, indulgent, and out of place in a world that demanded leadership. And if Isabella governed like a monarch who thought the throne was a lounge chair, the next royal on our list turned that lounge chair into a haunted bunker. Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria didn't just tarnish his legacy, he detonated it in a cloud of romantic delusion, political disillusionment, and royal dysfunction. 33. Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria. Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria was born to rule and determined not to enjoy a second of it. The only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, Cixi of Austria-Hungary, Rudolf was a child of empire expectation and contradiction. Raised in a palace of marble and protocol, he was expected to be the perfect Habsburg heir, disciplined, devout, and obedient. Instead, he grew up cynical, unstable, and wildly incompatible with the very institution he was born to inherit. From an early age, Rudolf chafed against his father's rigid conservatism. While Franz Joseph worshipped order and tradition, Rudolf leaned toward liberalism and reform. He read widely, supported modern science, and flirted with the dangerous notion that the Austro-Hungarian Empire might need some actual updating. But intellectual dissent wasn't welcomed in the imperial court. Rudolf's ideas were smothered. His independence was discouraged, and his relationships with his parents, with his wife, with the state became colder than the walls of Schönbrunn Palace. Married off to Princess Stephanie of Belgium in what was, predictably, a political match with no chemistry, Rudolf soon abandoned the idea of domestic peace. He threw himself into work, then into affairs, then into outright rebellion against his station. He reportedly drank heavily, grew increasingly volatile, and maintained a rotating cast of mistresses, companions, and confidants, some of whom fed his growing resentment toward the empire. The final chapter of Rudolf's life came in 1889 at Mayerling, the imperial hunting lodge outside Vienna. What happened there remains one of Europe's most haunting royal mysteries. Rudolf and his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera, were found dead in what was ruled a joint suicide. The scandal rocked the empire. Official explanations shifted, letters were suppressed, and the Habsburg court scrambled to contain the fallout. Whatever the truth, the Mayerling incident became a symbol of dynastic despair. Rudolf's death had ripple effects. It devastated his mother, Empress Elizabeth, and further isolated his father, who saw in the event the collapse not just of a son, but of a future. Politically, it removed the one Habsburg figure who might have steered the empire toward reform. His cousin Franz Ferdinand, next in line, would eventually be assassinated in Sarajevo, triggering World War I. Rudolf didn't burn an empire, but he cracked the foundation. His tragedy was more psychological than political, more personal than strategic, and yet its consequences were monumental. He was a royal who understood the problems of his age, but was too damaged, too angry, and ultimately too broken to fix them. And that's the end of our roll call. 33 royals who, in their own unique and often jaw-dropping ways, earned their place in the pantheon of the world's most infamous, arrogant, clueless, selfish, extravagant, oblivious, paranoid, manipulative, and yes, jerk-level monarchs. Each one left a stain on history, some tragic, some hilarious, all unforgettable.